Hi everyone, I'm Mims and welcome to the channel. Thanks for being here. I am trying something a little different. I am recording this video outside on the patio. We just had a little rain this afternoon and it was quite lovely. And so now it's cool and the air is fresh and it smells like rain. So Jupiter and I came out to the patio and I thought I would try making a video out here. The upside is I get to smell the air and it's nice and cool, which is lovely for a late summer day. The downside is that there may be some additional background noise. If it gets too noisy or if I see someone that sees me talking to the camera, then I may end up needing to delete this and re-recording it somewhere else. So you may hear a little background noise. Jupiter is with me on the patio, as he often is. And there may be some background noise. You may hear the background hum of traffic. That was an e-bike that just went by. We're close. I'm living right now, very close. There's a sidewalk that kind of connects a couple different trails, and so it can be busy. But again, if it gets too loud, then I'll move on. So this video is going, and you may hear Jupiter's sighing and snoring, which might happen soon. Jupiter the dog, who I talk about once in a while. I'm gonna pan over to him because I talk about him and I never show him. There he is in all his sweet glory. Anyway, so this video is going to be about a book and a deck. At when would that have been? The end of May, I posted two videos kind of close together. One was about all of my summer decks, and then I also did one that was what I wanted to do was kind of like a summer reading project. I wanted to try out reading tarot or using a deck along with a book, and I matched up some books and decks. Now, that part was not new. What's new is me sharing it with videos. I have often used tarot for reading for characters. In fact, that was something that was in a couple of my early books for tarot study. And I'm sure it's not, you know, if it was in at least two of the books that I started with, I'm sure that it's in lots of others. And I think it can be a great way to practice if you are not ready to read for someone else, or you just want to try something different in your practice. Maybe you only read for yourself, and so it's nice to read for characters, whether it's TV or TV or books or movies. That can be a great thing, whether it's one that you've read before or watched before or something completely new. So anyway, I just wanted to do kind of a little follow-up because originally I had planned on making videos about each book in a deck pairing, and for lack of time, I also just decided, no, I didn't want to. I thought I would just do a summary and what I think of it and if I'm going to keep doing it and so forth. But I also wanted to share, I came up with a book spread, or like a spread to use, and I'll share that as well. So I just dropped a deck, so let me get that and then we'll get started. First, I'll share the spread first and I'll talk about it, and then I'll talk about each of the books and decks and so forth. So here is the book spread, and I will put the timestamp. My handwriting is atrocious, so I will also include all of the details in the show notes, just in case this doesn't make sense. So I keep a spread book that I just use with index cards, and then I hole punch them on the top corner, and then I have a little ring that binds, like the same way like a 3-ring binder, but it's just the ring, and I keep several spread books, mostly just because they were too many to fit onto one ring. Anyway, I haven't hole punched this one yet because I've just had this in my journal, but I wanted to make it, and I liked my little illustration of a book. Okay, so here's the book spread. And I have, it's a book lover spread with a little dash of bibliomancy. So the first position, and technically I don't think the positions matter that much, but we'll go through it. So the first one is, what is a message hidden in the book that will be meaningful to me? And I guess what I was thinking here is often I'm surprised by books because, like, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you kind of know the general, maybe the general summary, maybe you've read the back, maybe someone's recommended the book to you, and so forth. But often, a really good book will have another message, and it may not be like the overarching theme, it may just be some other message that's kind of hidden within. And so, I like to do this spread, again, I just started doing it this summer, but with the books, I did it at the beginning, and then occasionally I would do it also at the end of reading it, and then kind of comparing, and also even going back and looking at the cards and my interpretation of them, and how maybe that changed after having read the book. So, yeah. So the first one again is, what is a message hidden in the book that will be meaningful to me? The second one is, how can I connect with this book? And I thought of this one as, it might be by reading and pulling a card here. This could be anything from like talking about it with someone else. It could be anything like maybe beyond how I usually connect with a book. And so pulling a card kind of gives me some ideas. The next one, what is one thing I can learn from the author? So that might be different than the book itself. It might be about the author, or something that the author, you know, whether it's the way that a writer turns a phrase, or their use of dialogue, or their description. It could be anything like that. So I left these sort of open-ended so that I could approach them depending on what the book is. The fourth one, what is an action I can take as a result of reading this book? That might be as simple as reading another book by the author. It might be as simple as, learning more about the author or the particular circumstances that are talked about within the book. It might be doing like a little bit of, easy research. Learning more about if the book mentions a particular point in history or a particular event that I'm not as familiar with, or I'm only superficially aware of it, maybe learning about it from that standpoint. So those are some ideas. And then the fifth one is, what is one thing I can reflect on from this book? So more about reflection. So here I've got like learning, and I've got messages, and then I have, actions, but I wanted something about reflection. And so this might be something that I draw, and maybe that's what I end up journaling about, for instance. So those are just some examples. And then the last one, I thought I'd throw in a little bit of bibliomancy. So bibliomancy is, taking the book and blindly flipping through it and picking a line out of it. So I'm not going to actually do this spread right now, but I wanted to share that. So I hope that that little explanation of the spread, while I'm not sharing spreads from this, will be okay. Or maybe I'll do one at the very end with one of these. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. So anyway, that's the spread. And I think this can work it could work with an oracle deck. It could work with tarot. I generally use tarot for spreads, but I think that this is definitely one that you could do with an oracle if you happen to match them up that way. So that's the spread. And again, I'll put the timestamp if you want to freeze the frame to look at that if you can actually read my writing, and then I will list the details in the show notes below so that you can, if you want to try to use that yourself. And let's now talk about what books and decks I have. First, I'm going to take a sip of root beer. That just felt like an end of summer kind of drink. Okay. I forget now the order that I said that I was going to read these month by month, but I'm just going to share them as I pull them out of the basket. So one of the things that I wanted to do, because I mostly have used in the past, mostly when I've used tarot, it's mostly been for fiction. Once in a while, I think I've done it for like a memoir where there might be like characters, well, there's characters in a memoir, you know, and sometimes they have some of the same decision points and cross points in the same way that characters in fiction do. You know, there's kind of an arc at times, you know, with that character's journey or that person's journey. So, but I wanted to definitely, my criteria when I was doing this was I wanted to pick books and decks that I already had. That was a big criteria. Another one was I wanted the decks to be decks that I was already planning to use for the summer. What I've recently started doing has been like picking sort of a basket of decks that I'm using for the summer. It doesn't mean that I won't also pull other decks off the shelf, but it kind of narrows the choice, and it feels like I then get to kind of focus on those particular decks. And then of course, if I end up adding decks over the summer, then there's additional things to talk about. But it helps me to kind of narrow my focus, and I like that. And in the past, I would sometimes just sort of pick like month by month, but I kind of like the seasonal approach because I feel like then it narrows my collection down for me and yet gives me a lot of choice. And at least at the beginning of the summer, I think I had picked 20 decks. So for this project, again, the criteria were decks and books that I already had, and decks that I was already planning to use for the summer. So decks that I had kind of pulled out as my summer decks. And then third, I wanted to match up each book with a deck. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't also read other books, and it also doesn't mean that I didn't also use some cards with some other books, but these are just the ones that I'm going to focus on. So the first one, again, these are not in the order that I think I shared that I read them, but that part doesn't really matter. So this one is more of a how-to. This is Sibley's Birding Basics. This is a book that I've had for quite a while, and in fact you can even kind of see that it's faded from my bookshelf. This is by David Allen Sibley, and it's how to identify birds using the clues in feathers, habitats, behaviors, and sounds. One of the reasons that I've been wanting to read this is I'm kind of at the age where I'm sort of tired about talking about the things that I want to do, and I'm finally like, just do them or stop talking about them. And since I was probably 15 or 16, I have wanted to be a good bird watcher. And despite that, and having friends that are really good bird watchers, I like to say bird watcher, not birder. I don't like that term. As a bird watcher, you know, in my teens and early 20s, and now I'm well past my 20s, I'm sure you can tell that, but just, but you know, like, what are the things you notice? And I don't like using apps for identification. I have an environmental studies background. I've always enjoyed being outside. I don't think that those things are unique, but I've been a naturalist, I've been an environmental educator, and I've often taught people like how to, maybe not specifically about birds, but like how to identify things and like to pay attention. And I know now that we have apps on our phones that can help us, but I feel like those phone apps and things are pretty similar to somebody telling you what something is. But if you use your observational skills, you pay attention more and you remember it better. And so I definitely wanted to get better at identifying birds. And so this book, I felt, does a really good job. David Allen Sibley also kind of revolutionized bird watching in the, I think his book came out in like, his field guide came out like in the late 90s or early 2000s. And I remember it kind of set the birding world on fire in a good way, in that it was probably the first time in a long time that a bird field guide really sort of changed the game. Really good illustrations, and now, you know, and it built on field guides from the past, Audubon, Peterson's, you know, the National Geographics, all of those. And again, we're not going to get too much into that, but this one kind of went along with the field guide, but this one is just more specifically about how to get into birds. And so it's everything from taxonomy and behavioral clues, and he talks a little bit about the structures, and I liked it. And I don't know why it took me so long to read it, and I'm not going to get into like a huge book report of it, but I quite enjoyed it, and I quite enjoyed how simple he makes it, and yet how complex. And so there are several different chapters. Oh, one of the things that I love about this book is it has this little flap. I wish all books came with this, because then you can bookmark where you are, and it's just such a nice little feature. I know I have bookmarks, but I love that little feature. So he even talks about sketching, you know, as a way to pay attention, you know, and it's everything from like, you know, paying attention to the size. So you're looking at things, and what you might do at the beginning is you just think about like, okay, what are the birds you do know? Like, okay, maybe if you know a robin, then you think, okay, is that bird bigger or smaller than a robin? Then you notice things like when they fly. Did you notice it on the ground? Did you notice it up on a branch? Did you notice it at a feeder? Where were you? Were you near water? Were you near a parking lot? You know, things of that nature. And then you could even then go beyond that and like, okay, well, it was a blackbird. Well, was that a crow or was it a raven? What are the differences in crows and ravens, etc., etc., etc. But I liked how he just really brings it down to just some of the common things. And you're not going to be able to always remember all of them, and some birds fly really fast. So that can be another factor. Like, you know, it just flits in. If it's a little songbird, you might only see it in the spring. Or if it's overhead, you know, did you notice anything about the underbelly? Did you notice anything about the tail? All of those kinds of things. And I just felt like this was a really good book. So, and I would highly recommend it, even though it's kind of old. So yeah, this came out in 2002. So I paired this book with The Little Bird Tarot and Field Guide by Shanna D. I've talked about this deck before. This is the first edition, and she now is in the pre-ordering stage. In fact, I will make sure to post this before her deadline is up, because her pre-order for the second edition is coming up soon. So anyway, her deck she made using the artwork of John James Audubon. And John James Audubon is known for these illustrations. And one of the things that I did is I definitely did the spread, but I also used, what's kind of fun about this is that while you have the titles of the cards, you don't have the birds until you get into her cute little field guide. So I birded the tarot deck. I paid attention and I birded almost every card, and then I would kind of quiz myself. I also use a field guide, So this was more about like observation and what you notice. But then I used a field guide to see if I could key it out. And that was really, it was fun to do. And it was easy to do in the sense of easy because these cards are so beautiful and clear, but also because of these illustrations. And it was kind of a fun, it was almost, I could almost use these in a way like sort of almost like a like flashcards. And so I'm like, okay, they're in a tree, I see bright specks of red, what else do I notice? And so that was one of the ways that I paired up these cards with this and then a field guide. And it was kind of fun to do that. So I quite enjoyed it. And this is one of my all-time favorite decks. I've had it less than a year and I just love it. I think she did an amazing job. And so, like I said, if you are interested, I will make sure to put the link to her, wherever she's doing pre-orders. I can't remember. I think she's doing it on her Etsy shop. I will include the link below, and I'm definitely now going to post this before her deadline is up for the pre-ordering of her second edition. And those are the backs. And so that is how I used the tarot guide, or the tarot deck, with the Sibley Birding Basics. And then I also occasionally would ask myself a question about, I know I did a spread where it was like, what's inhibiting me from becoming a better birder? And I remember, I don't remember now which card I drew, but there was something I remembered. It was like, oh yeah, it almost slapped me in the face. It was like, because you haven't made the commitment. And, hold on, upside down. I hadn't made the commitment or the time to become a better birder. And it takes commitment and time and effort. And that was a good reminder. And I know that I got that. And again, if I could recall, I would tell you what the what the card was. But I just asked that question occasionally. So I quite enjoyed those two as a matchup. And it was fun. I need some new words, I know. I need to read a thesaurus next. Maybe I'll do a thesaurus with a tarot deck as my next one. I feel like I say fun and excited quite a bit on this channel. Anyway, I quite enjoyed using this particular tarot deck with this book, and using it maybe in a different way than I might have normally used a tarot deck. You know, using the cards as that identifier, you know, actually birding the cards, bird watching the cards. That was kind of fun. So I quite enjoyed that matchup, and yeah, we'll leave it at that. Okay, next one. We'll go to, so this is Narcissus Nobody by Gina Yates. And Gina is a friend of mine. This book came out in 2021, I think. Let me double check that. So it's called Narcissus Nobody. And it's by Gina Yates. I think I just said that. It came out 2021, and it's by Three Rooms Press. So when I first met Gina, she runs a little vintage clothing shop. And I met her because I wanted to visit her clothing shop, and I ended up buying some stuff and becoming really good friends with her. We ended up having a lot in common, superficially and then otherwise. We both liked vintage, we both liked used stuff, we both had an interest in spirituality and so forth. We both are writers. She's a successful writer. I'm still more of a, you know, write a blog occasionally, scribble around in my notebook, occasionally get an article published, but not that often. whereas she actually had written several books. This was the first one that got published, but I just remember being excited for her. And one of the things when we would visit is that she would talk about, like, oh yeah, I just finished, you know, a novel. And she had written, and it was kind of always, it was always interesting to talk to her because I could hear about her journey as a writer and kind of those ups and downs. So, you know, everything from like completing a draft to doing the edits, you know, and then sending it off, getting an agent, and then getting an agent that didn't respond. And then I think she had at least another agent, and then she got a book deal. And she signed her book deal like in the very early days of COVID. So I'm pretty sure that her book deal happened in March or April of 2020. And, you know, we would talk on the phone, you know, a little bit and so forth. And the other reason that I talk about Gina is I know that I've talked about her a couple of times. She, because she thrifts, that's her hobby as well as her mainstay. She goes thrifting for clothes that she then sells in her shop, her vintage clothing store. And so when she knew that I liked tarot and so forth, she ended up she would save, when she came across a deck, she gave me 3 of them. They were all oracle kinds of decks. And in fact, we're going to get into one of those in a minute. But Gina, I wanted to reread this book. I had read it in the spring of 2021 after I bought it. I guess it was the summer. I think I got it in the summer. She signed it, gave it to me, but I wanted to reread it, and I was trying to remember what I knew about it. And so, like, I had read it, but it was kind of fun to put it down and then to come back to it, because I noticed other details. And I matched it up with the Neoteric Feminine Tarot, which I've shared before in this channel, although I think those videos have been deleted, but I used this deck in Drop 'em 78, and I picked it because it just sort of felt like the cover and the cards looked like they would match up. And because, I'll just show some of the cards. So this is the Neoteric Feminine Tarot by Weisspell. And I'm going to show a couple of the cards and then I'll talk more about the book, because it's so one of the things that I loved about this deck was it's all female, it's all feminine, but it's very much a Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And you can see here where they're in modern clothes, but they're in the similar postures and scenes even. You know, some of the symbolism is still there, but it's, you know, but it's been modernized, but it's still similar, I think, in a Rider-Waite-Smith way. I don't like to call them, it's a clone, because I think it is its own thing, but it definitely fits. And I particularly love this deck. I use it a lot for my own, like, personal readings, but I have read it with some others, and I used it last year for Drop 'em 78. Oh, and I love this star card and her blue hair. Like, how fun is that? Okay, so that's the deck that I used, and I did a couple different readings, not only for myself, but I also read for the character. And the main, I'll just do a quick thing. So Narcissus is, so Hope Townsend is the main character, and she falls for a disgraced love guru, like a self-help kind of love guy named Brooks Nixon, also known as Narcissus Nixon. And so it's her journey, and while it is a little bit of a love story, it's much more than that. I think it's very much about this character kind of waking up and seeing where she is in life and having to challenge her own thoughts about where she is. Is she stuck? And I don't know. Somehow that's what resonated this time around for me. Is that this character, I think, was kind of just going through the motions. And while I'm not in any kind of a romantic sort of phase, I'm not even interested. Okay, that's more than you want to know. But I definitely resonated with this character getting woken up in some way, shape, or form. And it could be a lot of things. It doesn't have to be a love interest. It can be that you finally just wake up to your circumstances and you think, you know what? I do want to change some things. And what is it that I want to change? And what are like some of the easy, obvious stuff to do? And then what's some of the harder stuff to do? And where on that spectrum can I start with the easy, obvious? Or do I need to really shake things up and go for the harder, more difficult stuff? Or is it maybe a little combination of both? Anyway, that's what kind of really resonated to me this time around in the story. And so, I love this line on the back. She also had some hapless romances, and it did help me to consider some of my past romance mistakes and otherwise, and it did make me think a little bit more about those too. It was kind of just nice to have some hindsight, and I think that this book sort of gave me some of that I maybe didn't have back in 2021 when I read it the first time around. Anyway, there's a line here on the back that's and he's also like a self-help guru, so how he's influencing her made me think a little bit too about some of the self-help stuff that I have used in the past, and where is it helpful and where has it been somewhat damaging. So that this is more like my personal reflection, but I really picked up on those things this time around. But anyway, the line here on the back is the about face earned him the moniker Narcissus Nixon and made him slightly less annoying to Hope, a goth music devotee who prefers animals over people. Hope's dueling traits of misanthropy and compassion often hinder her progress in relationships as well as jobs, as she provides home care to the elderly, listening to their stories while wading through her own, and does administrative work at a shady psychic hotline. So it was just also fun to read. And what I admire about her writing is that it's denser than you realize. You know, you pick it up and you think maybe it's going to be like a beach read. And it definitely feels like a good summer read. But it's more complex. And so, well, let's just do a little bibliomancy with this. Let's just see what we pick. The crisp white light of reality hovered at a comfortable distance from the safe darkness below. Oh my goodness, that's kind of perfect. So this book hops a little bit in time, and I also love the details that she includes. You know, there's music references and so forth. So I would highly recommend this, even though I'm only giving you kind of a brief overview. I'm not getting too much into the plot, but I quite enjoyed pairing it with this deck. And because even though I had read it before, I definitely read cards for both Hope and Narcissus Nixon, and not so much in that predictive way of like, ooh, what's she gonna do next, but what can she learn from this? And then also, what can I learn from her? So I quite enjoyed revisiting this book, and there were definitely details that I had forgotten about. So I definitely love rereading old books, sometimes for comfort, but sometimes you get something different, because it's kind of like using a tarot deck. You know, you pick the card, one day it means something completely different, and I feel like books can do the same thing. And so I love that pairing. And again, this was quite different than my nonfiction how-to, the Sibley Birding Guide with the Little Bird Tarot. Okay, next one. Again, these I'm just pulling them out based on how they are in the basket. I found this book in one of those little free libraries on the, I walk the dog usually a couple of times a day, and we're kind of lucky in this neighborhood that not too far you can find a free library. You know, I don't know if, I think they have them everywhere, but just in case, these are these little, and they're kind of built like a little house on a pole, and they have shelves and they have a door, and the idea is that people register them, and they would put, the idea is that you could grab a book, and then you could also place a book. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll grab a book, and in fact, I've saved it for this video, and then what I'm planning to do is take it to one of the other free libraries, just to kind of circulate. Because like I said, I think there's like 4, I can think of at least 4 right now that are within like a mile and a half distance from where I am. So that's how I found this book. And it's called Crazy in the Kitchen by Louise DeSalvo, and it's food, feuds, and forgiveness in an Italian-American family. And I paired it up with Terra del Fuego. I didn't have a food deck, but that didn't matter. I kind of just thought the Terra del Fuego felt perfect. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen the cards, but I'll still show a few, and then I'll kind of talk more about the book. I didn't know anything, I had never even heard of the book, but it sounded good, and I do like food memoir. So this, again, this is Terra del Fuego by Ricardo Cavolo. This is published by Fournier, and I love this deck. I just got it in the spring, and I think it's one of those decks that I'm going to love forever. There's so much to discover in here. There is so much to the illustrations and all the symbolism, and I love how much there is to see in this deck. Let's just look at a couple. Oh, I love this 3 of Cups. And Temperance. It's so busy and there's so much in it. And I used this both. I did a spread before I started it, and then I also I pulled some cards for the characters. So I quite enjoy a food memoir or food essay, you know, reflection books. This one was really good because it gets into family conflict, and it doesn't brush it away, and yet it also doesn't, what's the word? I feel like sometimes, and I'm not specifically about this book, but I feel like sometimes, especially when we get to memoir, I love memoir, but I feel like over the last maybe 20-25 years, there has been a thing about, like, you have to almost like outdo everybody with how much trauma that you've had in your life. Now, I don't mean that in a way of diminishing the horrible things that people have gone through. Like, not at all. In fact, I love that people are having the chance to share, take ownership of their stories, and so forth. But sometimes there have been memoirs that I've read where I felt like they almost just glorified the violence and the horrible things that have happened to them. And I love in this book because she's talking about food, and food is kind of that common denominator all the way through, she kind of also reconciles with some of her past and also kind of butts up against it. I really enjoyed this book. She's also written a few other books. She's written a biography of Virginia Woolf, and she also co-edited an anthology that was Italian American women writers on food and culture, which I kind of want to read now. So one of the things that she does in here is, I feel like, and in fact I feel like I've seen a couple of videos where people have talked more about like ancestor work and tarot, and I kind of feel like this book really got into some of that immediate family sorts of shadow stuff, but also then some of that ancestral stuff, and I quite enjoy this. So, like for instance, Louise's step-grandmother stubbornly recreates the domestic habits of her southern Italian peasant upbringing, she clashes painfully with Louise's convenience food-loving mother. Louise, meanwhile, dreams of cooking perfect fresh pasta in her own kitchen. And here, this is a great line. Passionate and bittersweet, De Salvo's story suggests that our image of the festive, bounteous Italian-American kitchen may exist in part to mask a sometimes painful history. And I think we all do that. And in fact, this summer, I grappled with, without getting into too much detail, I was needing to consider care of an older relative and struggling with conflict with siblings, not so much about food, but just struggling with ongoing conflict and maybe even dislike. I'm not sure that I actually love my siblings. And somehow it felt really good to read this book and to realize, like, oh, yeah, you know, we all have our different ways of loving each other or struggling with each other, and we all have different ways of dealing with that conflict and dealing with those shadows. And just because somebody doesn't deal with their shadows in the same way that I'm trying to deal with mine doesn't mean that they're wrong or that I'm right. And so I quite enjoyed this. And it felt like, because this book talked a lot about conflict, this deck, while it's not necessarily like a conflict deck, this deck really doesn't hide. It really gets to, I mean, look at that. Look at that Knight of Swords. Like, talk about dealing with your skeletons. Look at that Death card. This deck just felt like a really good matchup with this book. And she's also just a beautiful writer. I sit down at my desk. I want to begin writing a little scene about how I've been going shopping with my father. I also want to write about how I've gone to the cemetery with him because he's been pestering me to see where his parents are buried, where my mother and sister and other grandparents are buried, all crammed in death into one cemetery plot, like we are all crammed in life into our tiny tenement apartments. I want to write about how freaked out I get when I see my father's name and birth date are already carved on the gravestone, and yet I don't feel any sense of loss while I'm there. How I don't feel very much of anything. Though I like that you can see New York City from the gravesite, perhaps even catch a sliver of one of the buildings of Hunter College where I teach. This is a really good book, and I don't think you have to be, I don't think we have any Italian in our family, and it doesn't matter. I could relate to this and learn a lot from this. And I quite enjoyed this book, and I definitely want to read more by this author. So I think I'll leave it at that. Okay, last one. This is probably, actually there's two. I forgot. But I'm going to try to wrap this up because this video is getting longer than I planned. This is probably the most prosaic matchup. This is actually a deck that I got from my friend Gina. This is one of 3 that she gave me. And it's The Power of Now 52 inspiration cards. And these are they're quotes from the book. So the book came out in 99. This deck came out in 2002. So I think I've had it since 2016 or 17 when Gina gave it to me. And so it goes along with sections of the book. And there's 52 quotes. So you could pull one out and, like use it for a year. And they're just quotes. But what has been helpful is I would just pull a quote. I would pull a card before I sat down to read it. And then this is the book. Now, this was kind of a funny thing because I've had, like I said, I've had this deck for 7 or 8 years at this point, maybe even 9. Yeah, probably 7 or 8. And last December, our local Friends of the Library, on the last day of they do like seasonal book sales, which I think a lot of libraries do. And they also have, books that are out. But anyway, on the last day of their book sale, so it's like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, on the last day of the sale, they do, I think it's a way to kind of clear things out. And so I usually will go on the last day. And it's $8 a bag. So you can basically fill up a bag. And I did. I filled up a bag, and I got some books that I was going to do like for collage, and I found some other odds and ends. And in fact, I grabbed a handful that I could then put up in some of the free libraries around, because I've definitely taken from those free libraries, and I kind of like to recirculate in a way. So I'll try to find books that I think might be good to throw in into those little free libraries. Anyway, this jumped out at me because I had actually not ever read this book by Eckhart Tolle. So I really liked it. And like I said, I've been using this quote deck for quite a while. But sometimes the quote would come from a part that I wasn't even reading, and yet it would resonate all the more or it would stick out. And then there were a couple of times where the quote happened to be exactly where I was reading within the book. And, I don't know what odds are, but there's 52 cards, and there's 191 pages. So there were a couple of times where it kind of felt like a cosmic, like, pay attention. This is important. And I quite enjoy his work, and I don't know. There are some self-help or self-transformation folks that I find a bit problematic, and yet I don't with him. He definitely, I think, has helped me in terms of like working on mindfulness and some things like that. So let's just pull a card. Here we go. The Power of Being Present. Through allowing the isness of all things, a deeper dimension reveals itself to you as an abiding presence, an unchanging deep stillness, an uncaused joy beyond good and bad. This is the joy of being, the peace of God. Now, you could obviously substitute God, source, universe, your inner voice, whatever. And he often, I think, I'm trying to remember, I think he kind of interchanges those words. But I think for this one, the cards more highlighted points, even when it wasn't the same page, I didn't feel like it transformed the book in the same way that the other ones did. All of those other books, maybe because, yeah, I think this one was a little more, maybe if I had matched it up with a different book, but it still helped me to really zero in on the messages. And it also helped me to like slow down and like, okay, you're reading this card and then you're reading the pages. Take a breath. You don't have to speed through it. Slow down, be here now, and listen. Don't just read it, but take it in more slowly. It felt like eating soup rather than gobbling down pretzels, if that makes any sense. I'm not sure where that analogy came from, but I guess what I was thinking is, like, you can drink soup quickly, but if it's hot, you have to slow down. I wasn't drinking soup this summer, but these cards did help me to just kind of slow down, and it reminded me of how good this deck is. Like, I quite enjoy it. And I've had it for a long time, so I think I've kind of taken it for granted. A friend gave it to me, and I remember like, oh, these are cool. But yeah. Oh, here's a good one. The power of being present. And this is definitely a lesson that I have learned in therapy in the past. Whenever you notice that some form of negativity has risen within you, look on it not as a failure, but as a helpful signal that is telling you, wake up, get out of your mind, be present. So, again, this one maybe wasn't as, it didn't make the reading experience different, but it did feel like it helped me to, it almost felt like spiritual highlighting. I guess I'll put it that way. And I think I'm gonna reread this one more time, because now there's a big event that has happened more recently, personally, that I don't want to get into. And it feels like it's a transformational kind of thing. And I've been really not just thinking but feeling. And I would like to reread this while it's sort of fresh and see how that kind of is in the transformation. Okay. Last one. I've been reading some other stuff as well, but one of the things that I talked about at the beginning of the summer is it's Jane Austen's 250th birthday this year. She'll be 250 in December. I forget when her birthday is. It's December of 1775. I know that much, but I don't know the date. Anyway, I have several Jane Austen decks, but I had the Jane Austen Tarot. This is Jane Austen Tarot. This one came out in December of 2024, and I wanted to use this deck along with, I wanted to reread all of Jane Austen. I haven't gotten through much of Jane Austen this summer. Okay, gotten through also makes it sound like I made it a chore, and maybe that's why. But I borrowed this from a little free library, and again, I thought I would put it back. And then I know that I can get the rest of the books. Like, I reread Jane Austen all the time, like every couple of years, but I usually stick to the main 6 books. Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Northanger Abbey, oh my goodness, Mansfield Park, and I'm completely missing one. I can't even think. Anyway, there's the main 6, and it's gonna bug me that I can't think of all 6 of them. So there's the main 6, but there's also a few other books that are either like unfinished or were like writing from her as a child, or like, you know, at least in her teens. And there's 12 of them, and if I had thought about it in January, if I'd been organized, I would have just read like 1 book each month. But we're getting down to the last 4 months of the year, so if I'm going to read all of Jane Austen before at least the 12, if I'm going to read all of Jane Austen before the end of the year, then I'm going to need to buckle down. But I did read Sense and Sensibility, and I think this is my favorite I think this is my very favorite sibling relationship, even more than Elizabeth and Jane in Pride and Prejudice. I really love Eleanor and Marianne, and how different they are, and how close they are. And maybe because I feel like I don't have that with my siblings, even though at one point you might argue that we did. I'll show you the cards. In this deck, the pips are definitely pips, but all of the majors and the court cards are characters in the book. And then Jane Austen is the world, which I love that, because she created this whole, you know, universe. So this, I'm still planning to do this, and I've definitely used I have another Jane Austen deck, and I've quite often read Jane Austen with tarot, even when I didn't have a Jane Austen tarot deck. It's something that I'm familiar with, and I've also done it with some of the movies. I have a few of them on DVD, and I rewatch them for comfort, and also just, you know, and when I was first learning tarot, I definitely did that, you know, and thinking like, okay, what would happen if, you know, you didn't find out the truth about some of the scoundrels? Or what if someone had made a different choice? Or what happens at the end? I love reading and thinking like, what's that energy like? What is their marriage going to be like? Are they going to end up being like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, you know, thinking of that? Or are they going to have, is it going to be a relationship of partners or something else? So, like I said, I have only read The Sense and Sensibility, but it had been, you know, a few years. It's probably also my favorite movie of the Jane Austen movie. The one with Emma Thompson and Kate Blanchett, or no, the other Kate, one of the other Kates. Oh my goodness, not Kate Blanchett. Anyway, the other Kate. I'm kind of losing names and stuff, so I probably need to wrap this video up. Anyway, I realized that my Jane Austen reading, I'm not even close to reading all of the books. There's still, though, 4 more months left in the year. So I definitely want to keep up with that. So I think I'm going to keep doing that. What I will say about reading this book is I did a little bit of research, because there's a couple points where they talk about specific amounts of money, and I looked that up and what the equivalents would be, and having done that made me realize like how rich they were at the beginning, and no wonder it was such a struggle at the end, or at, you know, at the beginning of the story, because they go from being what would be like multimillionaires, you know, to being sharing rooms and living in a tiny cottage at the invitation of someone. And it makes me consider Jane Austen's life too. Like, why didn't they just, go to work? Some of that. Anyway, it just made me think a little bit, and maybe because I'm personalizing, not the part about going from being a multimillionaire, but my own, let's say, thinking about money, thinking about opportunity, thinking about moving, where I'm living, all of the above. It just made me think a little bit more differently about it this time around. But it also made me think a lot about how Eleanor and Marianne were really good to each other despite their differences. And despite that, and can I take inspiration from that sibling relationship to, how can I be better to myself, but how can I maybe also be better to my two sisters? I don't know. So that's my little summary of my summer, of my summer reading with Dex. I think I'm going to keep doing it. I'm not sure that I quite enjoy doing these kind of book reports on video. There's definitely a reason. Like, I didn't even know BookTube was a thing. I found BookTube even later than I found TarotTube. And I've only known about TarotTube for like the last couple of years. Year and a half, whatever it's been. But I'm not sure that I enjoy doing summaries of books on video. I definitely want to in the future. And in fact, I'm planning to do it with, I got a book for my birthday that's all about like tarot and art and kind of some of the history of tarot and a little bit of that. And I definitely want to read that one more thoroughly and then share what I think about that book. I know other people have done reviews of it. It's a beautiful book. But I think it's by Letitia Barbier, if I'm saying that correctly. Like, I definitely want to do those kinds of book reports. Like, hey, I think, like, once I've read it, not before. Or if I do, like, a study, let's say I don't know why I always bring up a Toast study as an example, but let's pretend that that's it. Let's say I do a Toast study and I read these 3 books and I, use these materials and so forth. I definitely want to share in that regard. Like, what do I think of that as a tool for learning tarot and other things? I'm not sure that I'm crazy about making these kinds of videos about every book, but I did want to follow up since I had made that video at the beginning of the summer. I thought it did seem important to, for one, wrap it up for myself and also to kind of consider. What I will say, I quite enjoy using, like, pairing a deck in a book. That was part of the fun, was just sort of picking. 2, I quite enjoyed how different books and different cards, how it made it a deeper experience. And reading is like breathing to me. So combining 2 of my very favorite things was quite lovely. If I do this again for fall, I might do the same thing where I just do kind of a summary at the end rather than like an exhaustive sort of book report. Because for me, reading does feel more personal, and so even sort of sharing what I think about books is a little gut-wrenching. We'll just put it that way. I've been in a book club before, and I definitely journal. I write about what I've read, and I definitely, take notes and so forth. But I'm not sure what I think of making these videos. And yet I did want to follow up since I had made that summer reading and book pairing. So I highly recommend doing it, even if you don't make videos. find a book on your shelf that you haven't read, or find an old favorite and pick a deck. And they don't have to be always, well, of course you can do whatever you want. Like, some of these are like very obvious, like Jane Austen novels with the Jane Austen tarot. The, you know, the how to bird watch book with a bird deck. But it was also fun to pair, you know, some nonfiction how-to. I had 2 nonfiction how-tos, you know, kind of a self-help, a self-transformation, and then a memoir, and then a fiction book. I definitely enjoyed going beyond just reading for characters or reading for characters in a memoir. So, you know, I do recommend it. How I make videos in the future about this, we'll see. Anyway, that was a long ramble. I hope it was helpful. I hope that book spread was helpful. I didn't share one. And let's do real quick a bibliomancy with Jane Austen, just because it's fun. Whom did I ever hear him talk of as young and attractive among his female acquaintances? Oh, no one, no one. He talked to me only of myself. I'm not sure what I'm taking from that. Maybe that, yeah, that one I'm not sure. Let's try another. This kind of discernment enabled her soon after her arrival at Barton decisively to pronounce that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marion Dashwood. So, discernment, we'll go with that. Use our discernment to go beyond the surface, but maybe we can take the opposite tack. Maybe we don't have to jump to a conclusion based on something we think we know. Dig deeper. Read more. Read deeper. Read deeper with your decks and your books. Hope that's helpful. Anyway, thanks for being here. I hope you're well. I hope you are taking care of yourself. I hope you're finding joy. I hope you're finding ways to take care of the earth and others in a mutual aid sense. Pardon the honking noise. And do you read books with decks? Whether it's tarot or an oracle, do you do it very often? I would love to hear. And do you have any good pairings of books and decks? That, I think, has been part of the fun, is just like looking at my bookshelf and thinking like, ooh, that would go really well with this deck, I think. That's been kind of part of the fun of this. So anyway, take care, and I hope to see you in the next video.